Right, hello. So greetings. It's my Sunday talk, Dr. Thomas Daffern. I'm pleased to be here and sharing once more with you some thoughts on philosophy, the state of the world, the geopolitics of humanity. You know, we're in this incredible situation, like a lockdown on the planet. I'm in touch with friends all over the world. We're all in the same boat. Hoping, praying for a medical breakthrough, a vaccine, some kind of cure for this. My job as a philosopher of medicine, I'm not a medical frontline doctor, but I've taught history of medicine. I've specialised in the history of religion and medicine, and so I'm very interested in the metaphysical aspects of healing. And on a planetary-wide basis like this, I'm interested in the metaphysical aspects of what we can do to help cure this situation, for which I've been working on the etiology, the cause of this. And I've published this in my newsletter, which I've circulated to Institute members. You're welcome to email me and I'll send you a copy. And I've talked about that before. I think, you see, for me as a philosopher of healing and peace, peace and healing are connected. The very first paper I ever gave to the International Body of Philosophers of Peace back in the 1980s, was on the connections between peace and healing. Philosophically, many great philosophers were doctors and healers. Pythagoras, but also Maimonides, John Locke, many others. And there's a very close link between philosophy and medicine. Pythagoras was slightly before Hippocrates, but they were from the same kind of milieu. I've been to Kos, where Hippocrates founded the first medical healing centre in the Western world. That said, obviously the Celts, the Druids, they had great healing centres, and some people now reckon Stonehenge was a healing centre. I'm sure that the 600 or more stone circles throughout the British Isles, the hundreds of menhirs and monuments throughout the Celtic world in Gaul and elsewhere were healing centres. The Druids were healers as well. And we know that in ancient Egypt, Babylon, etc., the priests of the temples also were healers, and they invented a lot of the medical traditions. These people were, good surgeons and so on, thousands of years ago. Well, okay, so please help now. We need all these great medical traditions to get focused. And whilst I'm a 100% believer in scientific, empirical, materialistic medicine and the physiology of the analysis of the cause being coronavirus, I think there is another dimension to that also, and that planetary healers like myself, we need to engage with that wider systemic problem. I've said before in my talks that to me the world is suffering from an attack of truth shortage. If we go down as a planet, if we can't crack this disease and we all kind of die, it's hopefully not going to happen, but I look at the figures and they are a bit scary, particularly in my beloved Italy, which I know and love well, and in China, which is an amazing civilization. Suddenly come out of the blue, and now I've just spoken to a friend of mine in Scotland whose husband is stuck in Devon. He's not allowed to travel back to her in Scotland. It's a clampdown on movement throughout the UK. And so families are being separated and so on. This is a nightmare. This is a nightmare for all of us. Well, why? Where's it come from? In my analysis, I've tried to explain possibilities. I'm generating hypotheses. I'm at that stage. Read my newsletter, you'll get 6, 7, 8 specific hypotheses, and if you can think of other reasons. And then we need to do some probability research, some epidemiological research into what is the most likely cause. I've just watched a very interesting, American movie from the 90s, I think, about a quarantine attack on Spokane in Washington, which it turns out was a deliberate thing being done by corporations to make profit. It's a good movie. Who knows? The official medical narrative is that this is a natural virus that started in the back caves of somewhere in central China, got into pangolins suddenly ends up in Wuhan. Now, what is the actual scientific historical progression of that? Where was case zero? I'd like colleagues to find out, medical experts, historians, forensic experts in disease. We need to know exactly where this started and find names, who was the case zero, where are the bodies. What was the link with the woman that was doing all the research on the caves and bat viruses, whose name I give in the newsletter? Did she somehow find this in some obscure little remote cave and bring it back to the Institute of Virology in Wuhan, from which it then escaped? These are interesting questions. My job is to generate hypotheses and questions. By understanding the etiology, we will be better able to cure this and also to prevent it happening again. That's why etiology is an important branch of medicine. Now, if, God forbid, and it is possible, as I've said in my newsletter, if this is an engineered bioweapons coronavirus plus, somebody's fiddled with the structure to make it a weapons level, outbreak, it's either leaked by accident or it's been done deliberately. There can't be two explanations, and I give the kind of background to those choices in the newsletter. Either way has huge implications ethically for humanity, and as a peace scholar, peace researcher, I've been calling for years that mankind should put our attention into peace research, not into weapons research, and that includes bioweapons. One of my great dearly departed colleagues, Dr. Steve Wright, who was professor of peace studies at Leeds Metropolitan University, he died very recently, tragically. He was an expert on new weapons research, and if only he were still alive, I'd be on the phone to him. Steve, your presence is much missed. I'm trying to find out who in the peace research community worldwide is an expert in bioweapons. Because, as I've said, the UN system has in place a treaty outlawing all bioweapons research. And so it has the legal right to inspect all bioweapons labs like Porton-Down, if anyone is suspected of making these things. Why isn't that happening? Why are the authorities not immediately going into Wuhan and all the other bioweapons labs in China and in USA and in Israel and in Britain and wherever they exist? That should be an absolute priority. I don't want to be speaking next week and it's still not been done. And yet one feels that the world leaders are dragging their feet. Are they really not very intelligent? I mean, what on earth's going on? These are the people with the duty, as are statesmen in power, to do something about it. I don't expect anything from Boris Johnson. The man has got a deficit of truth that he's a mendacious person, from top to toe, and therefore he will do nothing of value, nor Dominic Cummings, his minder. But from Trudeau and from Angela Merkel and from decent statesmen and women around the world. I noticed Gordon Brown, who at least had some integrity when he was Prime Minister. If he was Prime Minister now, I think he would be calling for a bioweapons convention inspection of all bioweapons labs around the planet, which is what needs to be done. To rule that out, I'm not saying they're going to find anything. Hopefully they won't. The longer they leave it, of course, the more likely it is they've thrown away any evidence, whoever's done it. But hopefully they'll find, no, squeaky clean, it wasn't us, Governor. That's great. But they ought to get in there quick, otherwise they're failing in their duty. You see, all these political leaders we elect and pay vast amounts of money for to swan around the world at conferences are failing in their duties to us, humanity. We're all sitting in lockdown, not knowing what's going on and what caused it. We're being told, oh no, that's all just conspiracy theory. Well, I'm sorry, we were told that about 9/11, and we now know it was a complete and absolute conspiracy. Read my book about it. As a historian, I've done the forensic research. It was not 19 Al-Qaeda people run by bin Laden from a cave in Afghanistan. It was not, end of story. It was a conspiracy. Read the book. The same with other matters, and I'm going to just raise a particular matter which I'll come back to at the end of this talk about the Kennedy assassination. You see, those of us who are old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination, I was a little boy at the time, 1963, I remember in Camptown seeing the news on the television screen, Kennedy assassinated. And my family I was growing up in, my parents were left, liberal, Democrat voter types. They loved Kennedy. There was a tremendous feeling of positivity and so on in the air. And we had a similar guy, a left-leaning Democrat, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister in Britain. There was a feeling that humanity can advance, we can go somewhere together. And I was brought up with that faith, a sort of Fabian faith. We may lose some battles, but we will win this war in the name of progress for all humanity. Kennedy was trying to make peace deals with Khrushchev. The shock of Cuba had, I think, galvanized them both into realizing they'd nearly destroyed the world. They had to make peace. Kennedy was a Roman Catholic, inspired by Pope John the 23rd, who was a great peace visionary, who'd issued a declaration, Pacem in Terris, that called people to make peace as a moral, spiritual duty, as Dorothy Day was campaigning for in America at the time, a great Catholic pacifist activist who edited the Daily Catholic Worker, it was called, as Thomas Merton was calling for from his retreat. You know, he was a peace activist as well. But they were inner peace activists, as Lama Gangchen calls it. We need inner peace education. So, so there was a hope we were going to get something. I was brought up in that climate. And suddenly Kennedy's shot. And the whole thing has turned upside down. The left suffered a blow in America from which it's never, ever recovered. The right took over, essentially. Whoever did that conspiracy, and it was definitely not just Oswald. I mean, that any idiot can work that out. Well, in my latest newsletter, I've given a really strong case for a conclusion to that question of who killed Kennedy. I think we now know. And I will come back to the end, possibly, of that at the end of this talk. Or you can read the newsletter. But I think the evidence is now pretty overwhelming who it was. And, of course, it's been hushed up ever since. And it looks, you know, that the same gang also were responsible for 9/11. I mean, all the evidence as a historian. You see, my speciality, my PhD, is in late 20th century history. This is my area. I've spent 40 years studying this and living through it. I think we now know who did Kennedy assassination and the killing of 9/11 tragedy. So, look at it. It's very interesting. And would people like that have done something like the coronavirus? Would they have actually deliberately done this as a weapons deployment? It is possible. You know, these people are evil. The people that killed Kennedy and the people that did 9/11 as a fake thing to get the world to attack Iraq. You know, this is a fake conspiracy narrative they constructed. And, you know, would they have expected such a catastrophic planetary attack, blowback? Probably not. Could this have been a rogue cabal inside the American elite military intelligence establishment working with, say, Israel, the UK, thinking, well, attack China and Iran and, you know, take down our enemies? It is possible. I suspend judgment. I'm not, you know, I'm just asking questions here and I'm looking at the evidence. And the most important first step to clear this up is to inspect the weapons labs. And the UN should be immediately authorising that. If those all show clean, then it's possible this was manufactured in a private, corporate, you know, manufacturer's lab somewhere. Scientists will make this kind of stuff for money. One of the things I argued with Professor Tom Kibble, who was president of Scientists for Peace and Global Responsibility, good friend and colleague of mine, when I was, well, I'm vice president of Philosophers for Peace and Global Responsibility. It's the same thing, but he does it through science. I do it through pure philosophy, which includes science, but includes metaphysics and the religious studies and, you know, sociology and all the ologies come together in philosophy, if you want. He and I called for a mandatory Hippocratic oath to be taken by all scientists when they graduate. So, for instance, the head of bioweapons research for Saddam Hussein was an English graduate who was of Iraqi descent who went back with a PhD from East Anglia University and was involved in a bioweapons lab research in Iraq, but she wasn't actually making anything that was lethal. And there was nothing there when they found it, but she had the skills to do that. And so these people should be sworn not to make weapons of mass destruction like this. Or you shouldn't be able to get a doctorate or a PhD. You know, it should be outlawed. That's something Kibble and I worked for. Kibble is now dead. He was knighted, member of the Royal Society, and I miss him greatly. It's a pity again, he's dead. Okay, I want to start this talk, and that's my little introduction to give you an idea of the ground I'm going to be covering. I want to base this talk around the metaphysical question we're facing as a planet. My job is philosophers for peace. And it seems to me that as a planet, a lot of people are saying something good can come out of this. I'm glad for that. Everyone that posts that is thank you. You're adding to the positives. I'm going to add to that. I think what has to come out of this is we have to turn away from the dark forces that do violence, that do ignorance, and that keep us in the dark and without truth. So I'm for increasing the truth content, and that means solving things like all the conspiracies, 9/11, Kennedy, and now the coronavirus thing discuss. But also all the others, missing persons, trade unionists who found decapitated in Ecuador or whatever, the death squads that the death of Kennedy then unleashed on the world. Because Johnson, according to the research in my newsletter, was in on the plot. Johnson was part of the conspiratorial team that then had Kennedy killed. Because he was too left-wing, he was too liberal, too radical. He was even prepared to make a peace treaty with the communist leader, Khrushchev. He would have got us to a place of, nuclear disarmament worldwide in the early 60s. Vietnam War would never have happened because it was only Johnson that then upped the ante and created the Vietnam War. Kennedy was going to end it with a peace treaty and pull all the American troops out in 63, right? And he was killed in November 63. And after that, the American right, which Johnson, was working with, whether they pretended to be Democrats is irrelevant. They were right-wing, often racist, etc. And one thing that joined a lot of them with the underworld was a sort of fanatical pro-Zionism. They were sometimes very, very pro-Israeli to the point of being anti-American. And the evidence that's come out is that it was a pro-Israeli faction in the underworld that worked with Johnson and others behind the scene to have Kennedy assassinated. So one of the things he was calling for was a peace treaty between Israel and Palestine. He was saying to the Israeli government, which was under Ben-Gurion, that they mustn't develop nuclear weapons. That he would cut all funding and aid from the USA to Israel if it continued to explore nuclear weapons. It had been the French that gave them the technology, but they were now developing it to make nuclear weapons. And Kennedy said, we're going to cut your funding if you go on making them, because we can't afford to have nuclear weapons in the Middle East. It's too dangerous. You've got to be a peace-loving nation. Make a peace with Palestine. Don't go down the nuclear weapons route, or we'll cut your funding. Ben-Gurion wrote back and said, you have no right to say that, Mr. President. We're going to develop nuclear weapons, whatever you say. Kennedy said, okay, well then we'll cut all your funding. And then Ben-Gurion resigned in order to become part of a secret team that were planning his assassination. Now that's the evidence I've read. I suspend judgment on it. And you won't read this in your conventional history books of the 60s. However, it all makes sense if, because Israel wanted nuclear weapons so badly, were they prepared to kill a president for it? Yes, the answer is yes. Were they prepared to work with Johnson, who was fanatically pro-Israel and pro-Zionist and hated Kennedy, even though they're in the same political party? Well, yes, they probably would. Does that mean American intelligence and culture were hijacked by a coup, by Zionist infiltrators into American public life, working with criminals. Well, actually, that's what it means. And the implications of that are that there was a rightward shift in American politics ever since. And we saw that in the Vietnam War, we saw it in the Johnson administration allowed Israel to acquire the bomb and allowed them to shut down any possible meaningful talks with Palestine for peace. It gets even more sinister because then the Six-Day War broke out in '67, and you know, Israel, Egypt, Syria, they all start fighting. America had a ship in the Red Sea called the Liberty, which was a spy ship full of listening devices and so on. And it was trying to see what was going on. And something extraordinary happened. This is now documented factual stuff. The Israeli Air Force bombed it to try and destroy it and blow it out of the water. And for 45 minutes they strafed the floors. They killed lots of people. They tried to bomb it repeatedly. Miraculously, it wasn't sunk. It survived, and people told the tale. The matter was entirely hushed up, and President Johnson's specific order was to hush it all up. There was no inquiry. And, you know, why would Israel attack America, supposed to be an ally? Why would it attack its ship like that? Well, the speculation in some of the research I've put together is that it was done deliberately because the idea was to sink it entirely and then blame it on the Egyptians, which would then give the US the justification for entering the war on the side of Israel. Well, that is scandalous. I mean, if I was an American citizen, I would be jumping up and down, demanding public inquiries, setting up, you know, investigative inquiries. I mean, where is the common intellectual, you know, voice in America nowadays that can listen and look at all this stuff and not do anything about it? So if that's true, as seems to be true, then it's part of that confirmation for the fact that Kennedy was assassinated by a team that included Johnson because of their pro-Israeli stand. Well, I'm pro-Israeli. This is what really annoys me. You see, I've been to Israel many times. I love it. I have many Israeli friends. But I wouldn't want this to have been done in its name. No cause is worth that amount of subterfuge and skullduggery. I mean, killing that president who was a good man in cold blood like that is a crime. And the people responsible should still pay for it and still be discovered whilst they're still alive. And if they included Ben Gurion and other people, I don't know, did Netanyahu know about this? Is that one of the secrets in the drawer, which means that he can never be ousted from office because, I don't know, he uses blackmail over people? There's another interesting thing come to light is that Kennedy never wanted Johnson as running mate. He didn't trust him, he didn't like him, didn't agree with his politics. The research points to the fact that Johnson was working with Hoover and they had compiled a dossier of Kennedy's sexual, you know, libidinous activities. Kennedy was a womanizer. He loved women, beautiful women, intelligent women. He had girlfriends here, there and everywhere. And they had a dossier of evidence. And so they used it to blackmail him. The FBI and Johnson said, well, the names are given in my newsletter. If you don't accept Johnson as your vice president, we'll bring you down by publicising all this. And it was enough to scare Kennedy into accepting this unpleasant character as his running mate, which was actually signing his death warrant if he'd have known it. He should have stood up to them there and said, well, look, you know, do what you want. Unfortunately, he didn't. So, but that sort of sexual blackmail thing has been used again. And I noted with great interest that the Sun newspaper in London a couple of days ago published a huge article summarising a book by a Mossad character, a general, an agent, who claimed to have been Jeffrey Epstein's handler and Ghislaine Maxwell, you know, the Epstein case. What they allege is that They were both working for Mossad, and he was their mastermind. And their job was to collect incriminating sexual evidence of rich, famous politicians having sex with underage people, get photographs and proof, so they could blackmail them for the rest of their lives. This was a Mossad operation that he was in charge of. Now, I don't know if this is true. I mean, it's unbelievable. And also that one of their victims, of course, was Prince Andrew, which is why he's now, running for cover. And probably they've got half the American and British elite all sewn up, This is why Tony Blair never said anything, even though he knew the 2003 Iraq invasion was a criminal offence against international law. So, don't have sex with underage minors if you want to do anything useful in the world, is my advice. And just stay squeaky clean, pursue the path of virtue. But that thing about sexual blackmail, it seems to be a feature, and if it was used against Kennedy, they're still using it. It's beyond scandalous. I mean, it is criminal, actually. And somebody should expose this. And I'm merely a philosopher for peace, but I'm talking the truth here. We have to research this because the planet is dying of lack of truth. And there's an accumulation of lies that have built up, and now it's so thick in the air you can hardly see. So I want to then shed some light. So this isn't a doom and gloom talk, that's what we're up against, guys. What's the good news? Okay, the good news is that it's in the book called the Dhammapada, which I'm doing a commentary on at the moment. Okay, the Dhammapada is discourses given by Buddha. And Buddha put enlightenment first, and truth, Dharma, the Dhammapada, the path to truth. As a Druid, I worship truth with a meticulous and forensic detail, as Acharya Mahapragya says. And, he was a great sage that influenced me, a Jain. Jains and Buddhists are very similar. We have to reconstruct and analyse what is true. And not, worship it. I'm going to quote you from what Acharya Mahapragya said in a talk about truth, because it explains where I'm coming from as a philosopher. I hope I can find it. Let me see. Right. Not in that one. Okay. What about in this one here? Right, so I've just published a book. Some of you will know, if you're members of my Peace Institute, you've already received a flyer. Others will have seen a posting I did on Facebook called basically Magical Peacemaking, a handbook for practitioners and theoreticians. And it's the first time anyone's ever published or written or researched a book combining two areas of work. One is peace studies, conflict resolution, peace research, conflict research. I've been doing that for years. That's my academic hat, well, part of it. And I worked, I met many of the key players in that and studied them, and I did a PhD on it all, telling the history of the evolution of peace research since 1945 to 2001. And you can consult that. I did far too much work for the PhD. I just did 2 PhDs worth of work. That's the kind of person I am. And so that's one sphere. And the second sphere is the people that are interested in esoteric philosophy and the mystical, esoteric, the occult, kind of approach to reality, that don't accept either vulgar materialism or vulgar theism, that want something in between. Surely the vulgar theists can't be right, surely the vulgar materialists can't be right. So where's the esoteric middle ground? That's what I've always gravitated towards since beginning my studies of philosophy in my teens, really, late teens in Brighton. And that took me to Buddhism pretty early on, because I discovered in Buddha a kindred spirit. He wasn't going to be fobbed off by oversimplistic explanations of reality. He wanted a path, a methodology on finding ultimate truth, which ultimately is what's called enlightenment. Well, that's what I wanted and still want. That's why I took Bodhisattva initiation when I was 19, And that's motivated and fueled all my research ever since. So that's why I'm going to share from the Dhammapada with you in a minute. But I want to quote this great Jain, Mahapragya, who was the great man. Unfortunately, he died. I met him several times at conferences on non-violence. So Mahapragya says this: my spiritual practice does not worship truth. It subjects it to minute surgery. The only mission of life is boundless curiosity to know truth. That is precisely my asceticism. It is not an external accoutrement, like a seed sprouting out of my being. There was a time when Indians actively pursued the method of directly experiencing the truth. The present-day Indian mentality is afflicted by indirect experience. Both his thinking and interpretation are borrowed. There is self-evident proof of its imbecility. I have but one wish, initial, medial, and final, to save the present-day India from the affliction of indirect experience and to lead it towards direct experience. End of quotes. Now, this is a brilliant quote from Mahapragya in the book by my colleague, Dr. S.L. Gandhi, called Acharya Mahapragya, A Journey to Wisdom, which was published by Harper Element back in 2015. And Dr. S.L. Gandhi, who worked very closely with Mahapragya, has pieced together his life story and his teachings and so on. He was very self-effacing. Mahapragya wasn't like a big guru. There's nothing, he didn't go around kind of self-promoting, but he just quietly got on with the work. And it's that devotion to truth that I want to echo has inspired my work. And that's why I'm saying to things like historians that say, oh, you can't look at 9/11, don't look at conspiracy theories and so on. No, I have to, because my line managers on the spiritual plane insist that we look at truth microscopically, in detail, like the Jains and Buddhists insist. Otherwise, we're failing in our intellectual duty, Lord Acton, a historian I have a lot of time for, pointed out the corrosive effects of power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that's what we have in the US. I think that's what we have, whoever was behind 9/11. I think that's what we had, whoever shot Kennedy. They felt they had this plenipotentiary right to power, and therefore it gave them the moral duty or freedom to do that. If it was done by a strong influence of Zionism against working in collusion with American Zionists to prove their enormous power, then we have a double problem, because the problem that their power base was that because they'd suffered the Holocaust and the cruelties of anti-Semitism and fascism in Europe, so it gave them the right to do anything they want in return. Because the Holocaust had nearly wiped out the Jews of the world, therefore now the fight back can be cutthroat, ruthless, shoot presidents, blow up, Twin Towers, do whatever you want in order to guarantee and establish the absolute forever power base that is Israel. Well, there's a moral error in that, obviously, because horrendous though the Holocaust was and all that, it doesn't then, two wrongs don't make a right. I learned that quite early in my childhood. It doesn't then justify committing crimes against the Palestinians or against anybody that speaks up for their rights. It doesn't justify killing presidents, or doesn't justify creating fake wars against Iraq because Saddam Hussein was pro-Palestinian, So discuss, but there's a problem here. So where's the light? How do we get back to the light? Okay, let's go back to Buddha. It was a co-worker, as I see it,